All our efforts in the existential analytic are geared to the one goal of finding a possibility of answering the question of the meaning of being in general. The development of this question requires a delineation of the phenomenon in which something like being itself becomes accessible phenomenon of the understanding of being. But this phenomenon belongs to the constitution of being of Dasein. Only when this being Cn has been interpreted beforehand in a sufficiently primordial way can the understanding of being contained in its constitution of being itself be grasped, and only on that basis can we formulate the question of being understood in this understanding, and the question of what such understanding presupposes. Although many structures of Dasein still remain in the dark with regard to particulars, it nonetheless seems that we have reached the requisite primordial interpretation of Dasein with the clarification of temporality as the primordial condition of the possibility of care. Temporality was set forth with regard to the authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein. The temporal interpretation of care was then confirmed by demonstrating the temporality of heedful being in the world. Our analysis of the authentic potentiality of being whole revealed that an equiprimordial connection of death, guilt, and conscience is rooted in care. Can Dasein be understood still more primordially than in the project of its authentic existence? Up to now, we have not seen any possibility of a more radical starting point for our existential analytic. Nonetheless, with regard to the above discussion of the ontological meaning of everydayness, a serious reservation comes to light. Has indeed the whole of Dasein with respect to its authentic being whole, Gansein, been captured in the forehaving of our existential analysis? It may be that the line of questioning related to the wholeness of Dasein possesses a genuinely unequivocal character ontologically. The question itself may even have been answered with regard to being toward the end. However, death is, after all, only the end of Dasein, and formally speaking, it is just one of the ends that embraces the totality of Dasein. But the other end is the beginning, birth. Only the being between birth and death presents the whole we are looking for. Accordingly, the previous orientation of our analytic would remain one-sided, despite all its tendencies toward a consideration of existing being whole, and in spite of the genuineness with which authentic and inauthentic being toward death have been explicated. Dasein has been our theme only as to how it exists, more or less, forward and leaves everything that has been behind. Not only did being toward the beginning remain unnoticed, but so did above all, the way Dasein stretches along between birth and death. Precisely the connection of life, in which, after all, Dasein constantly somehow holds itself, was overlooked in our analysis of being whole. Must we not take back our point of departure of temporality as the meaning of being of the totality of Dasein, even though what we addressed as the connection between birth and death is ontologically completely obscure? Or does temporality, as we set it forth, first give the foundation Boden on which to provide an unequivocal direction for the existential and ontological question of that connection? Perhaps it is already a gain in the field of this inquiry if we learn not to take these problems too lightly. What seems more simple than the nature of the connection of life between birth and death? It consists of a succession of experiences in time. If we pursue this characterization of the connection in question, and above all of the ontological assumption behind it in a more penetrating way, something remarkable happens. In this succession of experiences, only the experience that is present in the actual now is really eigentlich, real, worklich. The experiences past and just coming, on the other hand, are no longer or not yet real. Dasein traverses the time span allotted to it between the two boundaries in such a way that it is real only in the now and hops, so to speak, through the succession of nows of its time. For this reason one says that Dasein is temporal. The self maintains itself in a certain sameness throughout this constant change of experiences. Opinions diverge as to how this persistent self is to be defined, and how one is to determine what relation it may possibly have to the changing experiences. The being of this persistently changing connection of experiences remains undetermined. At bottom, however, and whether one admits it or not, something objectively present in time, but of course unthinglike, has been posited in this characterization of the connection of life. With regard to what was developed as the meaning of being of care under the rubric of temporality, we found that by following the guideline of the vulgar interpretation of Dasein, which within its own limits is justified and adequate, we could not carry through a genuine ontological analysis of the way Dasein stretches along between birth and death. Indeed, if we take this interpretation as our guideline, we could not even establish such an analysis as a problem. Dasein does not exist as the sum of the momentary realities of experiences that succeed each other and disappear. Nor does this succession gradually fill up a framework. For how should that framework be present when it is always only the experience that one is having right now that is real, and when the boundaries of the framework birth that is past and death that is yet to come are lacking reality? At bottom, even the vulgar interpretation of the connectedness of life does not think of a framework spanned outside of Dasein and embracing it, but correctly looks for it in Dasein itself. When, however, one tacitly regards this being ontologically as something present in time, an attempt at any ontological characterization of the being between birth and death gets stranded. Dasein does not first fill up an objectively present path or stretch of life through the phases of its momentary realities, but stretches itself along in such a way that its own being is constituted beforehand as this stretching along. The between of birth and death already lies in the being of Dasein. On the other hand, it is by no means the case that Dasein is real in a point of time, and that, in addition, it is then surrounded by the non-reality of its birth and its death. Understood existentially, birth Gebert is never something past in the sense of what is no longer present, and death is just as far from having the kind of being of something outstanding that is not yet present but will come. Factical Dasein exists as born existert Gebelitig, and in being born it is also already dying Gebtertig stirbt ease in the sense of being toward. Both ends and their between are as long as Dasein factically exists, and they are in the sole way possible on the basis of the being of Dasein as care. In the unity of thrownness and the fleeting, or else anticipatory being toward death, birth and death are connected in the way appropriate to Dasein. As care, Dasein is the between. But the constitutional totality of care has the possible ground of its unity in temporality. The ontological clarification of the connectedness of life, that is, of the specific way of stretching along, movement and persistence of Dasein, must accordingly be approached in the horizon of the temporal constitution of this being. The movement of existence is not the motion of something objectively present. It is determined from the stretching along of Dasein. The specific movement of the stretched out stretching itself along we call the occurrence Gesehen of Dasein. The question of the connectedness of Dasein is the ontological problem of its occurrence. To expose the structure of occurrence and the existential and temporal conditions of its possibility means to gain an ontological understanding of historicity Geschichtlichkeit. With the analysis of the specific movement and persistence appropriate to the occurrence of Dasein, our inquiry returns to the problem that was touched upon right before the exposition of temporality, to the question of the constancy of the self that we determined as the who of Dasein. Self-constancy is a mode of being of Dasein, and is thus grounded in a specific temporalizing of temporality. The analysis of occurrence introduces the problems found in a thematic investigation into temporalization as such. If the question of historicity leads back to those origins, then the place of the problem of history has thus already been decided upon. We must not search in historiography as the science of history. Even if the scientific and theoretical kind of treatment of the problem of history does not just aim at an epistemological, clarification of historiographical comprehension, or at the logic of the concept formation of historiographical presentation, but is rather oriented toward the objective side. History is still only accessible in this line of questioning as the object of a science. The basic phenomenon of history, which is prior to and underlies the possibility of making something thematic by historiography, is thus irrevocably set aside. How history can become a possible object for historiography can be gathered only from the kind of being of what is historical, from historicity and its rootedness in temporality, if historicity itself is to be illuminated in terms of temporality, and primordially in terms of authentic temporality. Then it is essential to this task that it can only be carried out by structuring it phenomenology. The existential and ontological constitution of historicity must be mastered in opposition to the vulgar interpretation of the history of Dasein that covers over. The existential construction of historicity has its definite supports in the vulgar understanding of Dasein and is guided by those existential structures attained so far. We shall first describe the vulgar concept of history, so that we may give our investigation an orientation as to the factors which are generally held to be essential for history. Here it must become clear what is primordially considered as historical. Thus the entry point for the exposition of the ontological problem of historicity has been designated. Our interpretation of the authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein and our analysis of care, as temporality arising from that interpretation, offer the guideline for the existential construction of historicity. The existential project for the historicity of Dasein only reveals what already lies enveloped in the temporalizing of temporality. Corresponding to the rootedness of historicity in care, Dasein always exists as authentically or inauthentically historical. What we had in view under the rubric of everydayness for the existential analytic of Dasein, as the closest horizon, gets clarified as the inauthentic historicity of Dasein. Disclosure and interpretation belong essentially to the occurrence of Dasein. From the kind of being of this being that exists historically, there arises the existential possibility of an explicit disclosure and conception of history. Making it thematic, that is, the historiographical disclosure of history, is the presupposition for the possibility of the foundation of the historical world in the human sciences. The existential interpretation of historiography as a science aims solely at a demonstration of its ontological provenance from the historicity of Dasein. Only from here are the boundaries to be staked out within which a theory of science oriented toward the factical workings of science may expose itself to the chance elements of its line of questioning. The analysis of the historicity of Dasein attempted to show that this being is not temporal because it is in history, but that, on the contrary, it exists and can exist historically only because it is temporal in the ground of its being. Nevertheless, Dasein must also be called temporal in the sense of its being in time. Factical Dasein needs and uses the calendar and the clock even without a developed historiography. What occurs with it, it experiences as occurring in time. In the same way, the processes of nature, whether living or lifeless, are encountered in time. They are within time. So while our analysis of how the time of within-timeness has its source in temporality will be deferred until the next chapter, it would be easy to put this before the discussion of the connection between historicity and temporality. What is historical is ordinarily characterized with the aid of the time of within-timeness. But if this vulgar characterization is to be stripped of its seeming self-evidence and exclusiveness, historicity is to be deduced beforehand purely from the primordial temporality of Dasein. This is required by the way these are objectively connected. But since time as within-timeness also stems from the temporality of Dasein, historicity and within-timeness turn out to be equiprimordial. The vulgar interpretation of the temporal character of history is thus justified within its limits. After this first characterization of the course of the ontological exposition of historicity in terms of temporality, do we still need explicit assurance that the following inquiry does not believe that the problem of history can be solved by a sleight of hand? The paucity of the available categorical means and the uncertainty of the primary ontological horizons become all the more obtrusive, the more the problem of history is traced to its primordial rootedness. In the following reflections, we shall content ourselves with indicating the ontological place of the problem of historicity. Basically, the following analysis is solely concerned with furthering the pioneering investigations of Dilthey. Today's present generation has not as yet made them its own. Our exposition of the existential problem of historicity and exposition, moreover, that is of necessity limited by our fundamental and ontological aim, is divided up as follows: the vulgar understanding of history and the occurrence of Dasein, section 73, the fundamental constitution of historicity, section 74, the historicity of Dasein and world history, section 75, the existential origin of historiography from the historicity of Dasein, section 76, the connection of the previous exposition of the problem of historicity with the investigations of Dilthey and the ideas of Count York, section 77.